Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than perhaps any other incident in the Cold War from 1946 to 1999. The crisis began on October 14, 1962, when American U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba brought back photographs revealing that sites for medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles were under construction. The Cuban missiles posed a serious threat for President John F. Kennedy because they were capable of hitting targets deep within United States territory. The missiles also posed a political dilemma for the president because of his campaign promises to contain communism aggressively. Coming after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and with only weeks to go before the midterm 1962 elections, Kennedy believed that American voters would see any decision that allowed offensive weapons to remain only 90 miles from U.S. soil as a sign of weakness. It's still uncertain why the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and Cuban leader Fidel Castro decided to install offensive missiles in Cuba. Some have speculated that the communist leader saw the missiles as a way to defend Cuba from another U.S. invasion. Others surmise that Khrushchev saw the missiles as a way to alter the strategic balance of power in the Cold War by creating the impression that the United States lacked the resolve to confront communism. It also seems possible that the Soviet leader saw the missiles as diplomatic bargaining chips he could use to extract concessions from the United States on other sensitive Cold War issues. To address the threat posed to U.S. interests by the Cuban missiles, Kennedy convened an executive committee of the National Security Council. The ExCom consisted of 13 advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, CIA Director John McCone, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, and Special Counsel Theodore Sorensen. For 12 days beginning on October 16th, the ExCom met in secret to plan the U.S. response. Almost from the beginning of deliberations, the ExCom concluded that the United States had to take some action that would remove the missiles from Cuba. Among the proposals discussed was a preemptive airstrike to destroy the missile bases before they became operational. Kennedy rejected this plan when the U.S. Air Force could not guarantee that all missile sites would be destroyed. The ExCom also discussed a land invasion of Cuba that would both destroy all offensive weapons and remove Castro from power. This is the point in time when an actual Black Ops mission to assassinate Castro may have been considered. The president, worried that this strategy would provoke a Soviet retaliation against West Berlin or lead to a general war, also rejected the plan. In the end, the ExCom agreed to impose a quarantine of Cuba, blocking all shipments of weapons to Cuba. Kennedy believed that this option would demonstrate the U.S. resolve to prevent the missiles from becoming operational and would also provide time for a diplomatic solution to be found. The quarantine of Cuba began on the morning of October 22nd. Later that evening, in a televised address, Kennedy revealed to the American people for the first time the existence of the Cuban missiles and the plan for their removal. For the next several days, Cold War tensions reached their zenith as the world waited for the Soviet response. The first part of that answer came 2 days later, when the first Soviet ships bound for Cuba reversed course to avoid the U.S. blockade. On October 26, Khrushchev sent 2 cable messages to Kennedy that provided the second part of the Soviet response. In the first message, the Soviet leader offered to remove the missiles in return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. Before the president could respond, a second, tougher cable arrived. In it, Khrushchev demanded that until the United States pledged not to invade Cuba, and also dismantled its Jupiter missiles in Turkey, the Soviet offensive weapons would remain on the Caribbean island. Although the United States had already decided to remove the Jupiter missiles because they were obsolete, the president refused to include them in any settlement for fear that it would appear that his administration had been forced to make concessions to the Soviets. On the advice of Robert Kennedy, the president resolved this dilemma by accepting the terms of the first letter he had received from Khrushchev and simply ignoring the second letter. While the Kennedy administration waited for a response, Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrinin, on October 27th. The Attorney General insisted that unless the dismantling of the missiles began within 24 hours, the United States would remove them. At the same meeting, the president's brother made clear that the United States was willing to remove all the Jupiter missiles from Turkey in the near future, but insisted that their removal could not be part of the public settlement reached by the two Cold War adversaries. Early the next morning, October 28th, when Khrushchev replied to the president that the missiles would be removed in return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. The crisis seemed to have a sobering effect on both the United States and the Soviet Union. The realization that any slight miscalculation during the crisis could have triggered a nuclear war led both nations to establish a hotline providing rapid, direct communication between Washington and Moscow. The crisis also apparently encouraged Premier Khrushchev to soften his rhetoric against the United States, for he again began to emphasize the importance of peaceful coexistence with the United States. It similarly led President Kennedy the following year to initiate negotiations with the Soviets for nuclear arms reduction. The product of this effort was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed on July 25, 1963, which ended atomic tests in the air and underwater. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis did little to improve U.S.-Cuban relations, in retrospect it seems clearly to have begun the process of easing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union less than a decade later. The Cuban Missile Crisis very nearly could have been the most catastrophic event in the history of mankind. With an arsenal of nuclear weapons at their disposal, both powers could have unleashed a barrage of warheads which surely would have changed the landscape of Earth as we know it. There is no telling just how much damage even one of these missiles could have made. But one only needs to remember the nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, to understand the impact they had. Each nuclear bomb killed hundreds of thousands of people, both from the initial blast and from later radiation illnesses. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we narrowly escaped seeing the world covered by nuclear fallout. Let us learn from our mistakes and dismantle all nuclear weapons. No country, despite how worthy and civilized they may perceive themselves to be, should be given the power to annihilate so many people with the push of a button. Peace, not war, my brothers.